way, Carlton King is a former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, but really majors in on the world of geopolitics, the world in which we are all, I guess you could say, pawns. The powers that be control how we think, what we see, what we understand, how we even compute the way we see the world in terms of our very earliest understandings. You know, when you think about when you went to school right in the beginning, it told you how you felt about your surroundings. So this is really, and more importantly, before I say that, more importantly, how you felt around others not within your orbit. So example for me, when I went to school, I was told the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact were ready to attack us. And so the whole of my understanding of the world was based on that received knowledge, fact, because it came from a teacher, and how we should then reflect and react to that. So I was told, example, that the British Empire was great and that it had done good around the world. So we receive and react to that process. Whether it did or it didn't is immaterial. The fact is, that's what you're given to understand. And then as you grow, you see how the tectonic plates of nations function with or without each other, or against each other, or towards each other. And then we are told this is how we should function within that process. So yes, our show is actually about the geopolitics. Now, normally I have at least two guests with me. Well, at least one guest, which would be Fergus Isaac from the media. Why? Because the media is one of the most powerful tools that provides you with that information out with education and out with your parents, etc., who've also gone through the same education in a general way. And then, oftentimes, in addition to Fergus, I have Dr. Rachel. And Dr. Rachel also is part of the toolkit, if you will, of the system, which tells you how you feel, what is right or what is wrong in terms of medical perspective. And she goes a little bit further because she looks at how the brain and the mind function, etc. So that also is received and given information. So again, I think with us three together, we have a fantastic toolkit. And then I add on guests as and when they are required or dependent upon the subject we look at. But there are also times and circumstances when I decide to do what I call critical thinking episodes. And these are episodes when, frankly, myself, I actually look at something and I kind of say to myself, where are we going with this particular situation? Oftentimes it might be war, it might be, I don't know, let's say a pandemic, it might be, what we think about the policing systems in our country, etc., etc. It basically is something that I often do in isolation on my lonesome. Today is one of those critical thinking issues. And what I want people to think about is I want them to look very, very closely at how we, as a people, as a nation, as a world, see the dangers of the world and see where we are within those dangers, see whom we support and who we don't support. Why? Because unless you were, unless you were on a desert island sleeping, you will have heard of the situation in the Ukraine, and you will have heard of the situation in the Middle East, Palestine and Israel, or you will have heard of how China is moving forward. And depending upon where you sat in that, so if you sat in the West, that would be given to you as a threat. China's moving forward. It's trying to take over the world economically, so it's a threat. However, when we say our policy is to take over the world economically, as we once had within the British Empire, or the United States says its role is to maintain that hegemony of economic power, then that's not a threat. So you see, it's these things that I want you to look at, because I am now, I believe, at a crossroads in terms of our safety and security. In terms of, will we or won't we have a situation where things get out of hand and we end up with, don't get me wrong, people are fighting within wars as we sit, and people have been fighting within wars forever and a day. But as it relates to the country that I live in, yes, we fought in wars. So that's Great Britain. We fought in wars. But the reality is, since the Second World War, the wars that we have fought within have not touched us. It's been something that we've worked on, orientated ourselves to, involved ourselves in, undermined other people in order to get involved in their struggle, or to create a struggle that would then be advantageous to the United Kingdom, or it is perceived that it be advantageous to the United Kingdom, or indeed the Greater West. Because oftentimes we've worked in tandem with the United States, and the greatest proponent of advantage has then been the United States. And I guess we've had an element of advantage in terms of our political power within the world, perhaps, by sitting close to the United States. Or that was at least the perceived wisdom. I don't necessarily believe that, but I know that's the perceived wisdom that politicians believe in, because they've said it to me directly. And I mean, the most senior of politicians, foreign secretaries, have said that to me, defence secretaries have said that to me, etc. So, where are we now in the world, and what is the circumstance that I think we are treading along that is potentially dangerous? So let's look at two wars, I think, to articulate this. I think, but first of all, what I should do is actually say to people listening, wherever you are in the world, that there's wars all the time. And so if you were, example, in the Sudan, the war that's been going on in the Sudan and has probably cost the lives of up to 100,000 people, displaced millions, gets very little coverage because, frankly, it's a war in Africa and not too many people are interested in that, because it just is a war in Africa, so why are we really bothered? Oftentimes what happens is people turn around and say, it's just because it's far away. Well, that's not true, is it? Because if the war was sat in, say, Australia, nigh on the furthest you can, or let's say New Zealand, the furthest you can get away from the United Kingdom, we'd still be talking about it. So that's not really the circumstance that it's far away. It's just that it's an area that we think there is little interest or influence within. The same could go for conflict in Ethiopia, which was running, or in Eritrea, or in Somalia, which has been going on forever and a day. You could then definitely say the war in the Congo and the conflicts in the Congo that continue have meant nothing. Again, some may turn around and say, well, these are civil wars. Well, you could argue that the war in the Congo definitely isn't. It is clear that there is assistance coming from Rwanda to support the M23, to support actions that are happening in Congo. So again, that's not really the reality behind why we are interested or why we're not interested. And of course, you could jump across to South America and you could talk about situations that have been going on in, say, Venezuela or in Colombia or even in North America, and talk about Mexico, where there's been, for all intents and purposes, a war. You could argue it's a criminal activity of drug barons fighting, but of course the action that they are fighting in Mexico is directly because of the contravention of actions being taken place in the United States. So the fact that the United States says drugs are banned and then goes after the Mexicans who supply those drugs to the United States, and at some level has led to the conflict, because there was one stage when the DEA, example, were arming the narco gangs so it could see where the firearms were going to. It ran out of control and a whole load of people got weapons, which then caused higher levels of conflict in Mexico. So you see, the actions and reactions keep playing themselves in and out regardless of where we are. But no, let's make our concentration on the two major conflicts that are happening right now, which could see us dragged into conflict at a level that would actually, at one stage, potentially cause devastation to our own country. I'm talking about the United Kingdom now, and obviously if you're in the United States, that means the United States, etc. So there's two which are ongoing, which is Arab-Israeli and the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine, and there's a third which the United States is pushing heavily to try and create, so it can undermine the potential of China to become the number one power within the world. And we should already say that by some means, economically at least, China would appear to already be that number one power in the world. Now, of course, the GDP of the average American, so that's specific to individuals now, not the national GDP, is far greater, and it may well still be that the GDP of the United States vis-a-vis China is still higher. However, definitely for sure, the general amounts of monies earned by the individual American, especially the 1%ers, is greater than the percentage of monies made by the average Chinese citizen. So it depends how you measure what wealth is. But then, of course, using that criteria, you could argue that a small country, say like the constituent parts of the UAE, have a greater level of individual wealth than they do in the United States. So these economic questions, these economic criteria are always up for questioning. But the bottom line is the US is fearful that China takes the number one position from it in the world. Now, what is clear to me is that China, and I'll say it loud and clear, has very little interest in militarily taking on the US mantle of having soldiers stationed all over the world. And you only really need to look at one criteria for that. The United States presently has around 800 bases around the world. As per my knowledge at present, and I don't think I'm in any way, shape or means wrong, the Chinese, People's Republic of China, has only one base, and that was in Djibouti. And that was put there to make sure that the seas are open, and also at one stage to push aid and assistance into the African continent. So you can see that militarily the US goes about its business with a military aspect to it, a very strong military aspect to its activities, and that would bring them into my game, into the secret world, whereby it is not disputed by the Central Intelligence Agency, which is the primary intelligence agency of the United States, that it has been involved in regime change, and that's a polite way of saying changing the leadership of a country without that country allowing the leadership to be changed by democratic means. So the United States have changed leadership about 75 times, I'd say a minimum thereof, since the Second World War. I'm not familiar with any such circumstance of China changing any country's leadership at all. Now, China has flexed its muscles in demanding areas back to China that it says were ceded from China in the times when it calls the centuries of shame, when it was a colony of various places, particularly places like Shanghai, where they didn't take the whole of the country, or the Japanese in Manchuria, etc., areas that they took over from China. So what China seems to do is to be of assistance for the raw materials it requires and influence it requires by providing economic capacity in terms of infrastructure building. So that seems to be China's biggest aspect. It tends not to ask questions as to what that country's policies are vis-a-vis the world. It just tends to ask the question of what is the deal that we can do for me providing you with whatever it might be. So let's say it's keep with the African continent because it's a good example thereof because they've made massive changes there. So let's say in Kenya, you want me to build a railroad from Nairobi to Mombasa. Great, I will do that. It will cost X amount. What can I get in return for either the monies that you're going to pay me directly, or what do I get in terms of raw materials I need, or whatever it might be. So that tends to be the Chinese perspective. And the Belt and Road Initiative, which is an initiative put together by the Chinese and has pushed through many countries in Central Asia, indeed all the way through to Western Europe, in Africa, those are the primary sort of areas: Central Asia, Africa, and Southern Europe. The Belt and Road Initiative tends to say, let me build on the old Silk Road of old, i.e. the trade route, let me build, and then, let me bring back to China the goods that I require, or give me possibilities for me to move my raw materials around the world, my finished materials, around the world, so I can get the raw materials that I require to keep me in the manufacturing base for the world. So that seems to me what China's done. Now, why do I mention all that? I mentioned it because that has been very, very successful, and the problem is that the United States has not been able to challenge that in that way. Indeed, the Chinese bought up a lot of the United States debt in terms of the United States dollar in order to allow them to keep that moving. And the dollar, as you know, has been the currency that the world has used for its trade. So the United States has saw an advantage from that to some extent. But you could argue it slept while China grew, or you could argue that because money was dominant, that it was happy for the Chinese to use the dollar, and to some extent, those people who want to keep the US as number one and don't want to share the powers of being a primary state then woke up too late and basically wanted to stop the Chinese power base from pushing them off that number one pivotal position. So, what does that mean then, effectively? It means then that there's been all sorts of shenanigans that have been put forward by the US to try and then either isolate China or try and move China away from the position it had in terms of being the world's industrial base, being the world's economic basket, so it can produce all these things that people all over the world require. And I think if you go back to the era of President Obama, his attempt to do that was by building a unified system with other Asian tigers who were pushing forward also in their way to become economically powerful. South Korea, people coming up like Vietnam, nations like India and the way that might move forward in order to work, in a sense, against the Chinese in their own way of doing it, in their own backyard. So by allowing US business to move into these other countries rather than move into China, and keep China a little bit at arm's length, but do it that way. And then pivoting its military to some extent to the Pacific away from Europe. So that's kind of what Obama was doing. I think that when President Trump came in, he is very transactional, he is about business, and he particularly saw the business perspective that we still need to be number one, America first, etc., etc. So tried to hit the Chinese by saying, okay, China, you produce all this stuff, it's because you do it unfairly. In other words, you don't let American industry into your country, so we will put tariffs on your goods, i.e. taxes on your goods, so you can't sell them in the United States unless you lessen the levels of tariffs on American goods so they can have a level playing field. It was all about sorting out a level playing field of business, and you can then move forward in that way. I think that wasn't necessarily that productive for the pure and simple reason that China is very entrepreneurial. And this is the mix mash of lack of understanding. It's a communist government. Yes, it is. The Communist Party run it. But the people are capitalist in every way, shape and means. And so therefore, the Chinese system allows for a lot of attempting to work on new areas of technology that would allow them to become the best. And if you clamp down on preventing your technology moving to China, what China will do is create its own technology to challenge yours. Now, in the past, people have said, that's been done by the Chinese, stealing the intelligence from other countries, watching how other countries do it, basically looking at whatever the article might be, then stripping it away, and then rebuilding it, and then adding a few Chinese factors to the rebuilding of that. Basically espionage on an industrial status. Yes, that could well be the case. But of course, it's nothing that everybody hasn't been doing forever and a day. All countries have done that. If I say to you that gunpowder was created first in China, well, of course, how did other people get it? By watching what the Chinese did and copying it. That's basically what everybody does. So that's a sentiment of sour grapes. And if it's a more highly structured aspect thereof, and you haven't secured your industries from that being taken, that's down to you, country, whatever you are. But I suspect actually in most cases that's not the case. On most cases what happened in the past was China said, let's work with you, company A, company B, you are capitalists, let's work with you, we will give you the opportunity to show us how you do this, and then you can sell your goods into our market, right? And a market of 1.5 billion people, of course any capitalist says, yes sirree, I'll have some of that. So people went into China, did their goods, put their factories in China because it's then easy, because they can pay the people cheaper, etc., etc. And then the processes of how things were created were seen by that, even if nothing else was done. So in other words, it's not as though China grabbed people and said, you must do this. No, people came in because they saw money could be made, and even more money if I sited the factory in China. And then once you site the factory in China and the goods are created in China, then Chinese know how to create them, even if they didn't before, which many times they did. Because the other side of the big Chinese structure, which has been very, very successful, is that unlike in the West, in many places, they haven't treated education as a higher echelon privilege. What they've done is try and educate the mass of their people to the highest levels, sending them to universities all over the world. If they didn't have it in their country, let's send you elsewhere to learn it. And then they bring that educational advance back, and then they create newer products. So example right now, China by far is ahead in the world of electric vehicles. Why? Because it invested in it. The government saw this is an advantage point. This is a 15-year plan. We will allow you to go forward and make that happen. And the government directs the industrial capacity to do that on a quasi capitalist, but also control communist process, because the actual structure of the future proofing of the event was from a political stance of being communist, but the process of it actually happening was a capital perspective by let's see who gets there first and let's see who makes it happen. So, you can fall by the wayside. So there's not then a lack of innovation. It's not, they're only going in one route and there's no innovation. No, several different companies will work at the same thing and some may fall by the wayside. But the plan is for it to keep building. Why is that important when I'm talking about dangers in the world? Because right now, under this next regime that's coming to power, the regime of the present President of the United States, President Biden, is we can't stop it economically, so let's now try and stop it quasi-militarily. And this is where it becomes very, very dangerous. So let's try and make the Chinese make mistakes and take some action in Taiwan, an area which it claims as China, and has claimed ever since the nationalist Chinese Chiang Kai-shek, who before ran the whole of China, when they were defeated in 1949, ran across to Taiwan for a short period of time of some 17 years, was recognized by the US as being China proper. Taiwan was, because they didn't recognize the communist Chinese because of the then conflict between communism and capitalism. However, seeing opportunities, and this is what it is again, seeing opportunities for American business, etc., and for American opportunities, what happened is in the 70s, that now less than distinguished president, not because of his opening up of China, by the way, but because, of course, of the Watergate circumstance, President Nixon basically recognized China and said that the actual China is not Chiang Kai-shek's Taipei, the China of Taiwan, but the China of the mainland, and that is China that we will recognize. And basically then also added to that, and we recognize the fact that China, mainland China, Communist China, the People's Republic of China, if you want to give it its proper name, has a right to Taiwan. Right? Now, we agree that it should be done by peaceful means, etc., 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 but it should take it over. So that's what was said. And that's why, of course, we were outmaneuvered in Britain and, in the end, had to give up Hong Kong to the Chinese, and the Portuguese had to give up Macau to the People's Republic of China, because that was the politic of the time. So the politic was, that belongs to China. Indeed, when that 1947 agreement was made, the South China Sea, even as far as the Philippines, was perceived as being China. The agreement was made at that time. Now, it wasn't necessarily articulated fully, but the agreement that the People's Republic put forward was accepted. This is your China. Now, I believe it wasn't ratified all the way down to the Philippines. and I don't mean including the Philippines, I mean the islands, that the seas areas off that were perceived as being, I think it's called Plan B or something like that, were perceived as being China's areas of influence and the Chinese Sea. In the same way as we argue in Britain that the seas off the Falkland Islands are British. And it's like 5,000 miles away from the United Kingdom. In fact, 10,000, I think. So, there are normalities in this acceptance that places are yours, even though they're thousands of miles away from you. That's an acceptance. In other words, there wouldn't have been a British Empire if that wasn't the case, And places like, top of my head, Jamaica, example, was run directly from the British Parliament because it was a part of Britain. France did exactly the same, that ran all of its empires and still does today. The South Pacific Islands, example, are still French Polynesia. It's still run by the French, exactly the same. It's not a colony, they're parts of France. So you see, it's not new that places far, far away from you can be perceived as your backyard. So we have to put that into context. So what I'm saying is, and the reason why I bring China up first, because it's the easiest one to look at, is when you look at the Chinese and look at China, and you look at how President Biden has kind of shifted his way of dealing with it from either that of Obama, which was shut China out a little bit but work with it, but also bolster the militaries around it, the US militaries that is, and bring in people like Australia into that and to have a bolstering mechanism, but actually maximise it on working with other partners, Japan, South Korea, etc., not necessarily militarily, but economically to lessen China. And the way they were doing that was by the TPP, so the Trans-Pacific Process, which is why they wanted to do that in that way. What happened is that, as I said, when the next president came in, I was going to be a little bit funny. I shouldn't be, but the orange man came in. President Trump, he saw it differently, and he perceived that he would do it via carrying out trade sanctions more aggressively, because that's the type of individual he was, as a more transactional person rather than a longer thinking individual on that area. But what Biden has done is neither, and he's gone down the route of being confrontational in terms of arms, as I said, and trying to push China into some sort of action against Taiwan, as well as bolstering the Taiwanese against the original perspective put in by Nixon about not bolstering the Chinese in Taipei, in Taiwan. So that's what's been happening. Now, I don't know whether there's been an analysis that says China's military is okay, they got a lot of people, but if we leave it for another 20 years, the military will be so strong, we'll never be able to come against them militarily, so let's push them now. Don't know. Why do I say all of this? Because now all you need to do is swing across to Russia. Now, this was started under President Obama, whereby seeing the threat from Russia, and I'm saying this from the Western perspective, seeing the threat. The reality is there is no threat. What it was that Russia was no longer happy to allow the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, to push its military alliance all the way to the borders of Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, to Russia, all around it. Now, the reason why I put that last little bit of all around it was, it did clearly allow, let's go back, in 1991 when the agreement was made that there would be a unification of East and West Germany. In reality, it's not a reunification, it's West Germany sucking in East Germany and it then controlling what was previously a communist state of East Germany. And I guess, and I know that because I was about and I was there and I was part of it, integral to it in many ways, that I understand what went on. And I had the last minister president from East Germany, Lothar de Maizière, came through, and I spoke a lot with him when I was doing some protection for him, and we got on well, etc., etc. When I spoke to him when he came to the United Kingdom. What was clear to me and what was clear to de Maizière was that if they did not become part of a united Germany, soon, very soon, East Germany would have few people in it. Because the law of the West was so strong that, frankly, once they had the freedom to move, most East Germans would have left and gone to the West. You know, they had the language, the right to be there was given to them under the old system. Anybody who managed to get the way out of East Germany in the past had become Germans. So there's the right of Germany, etc., etc., etc. And for all those reasons, frankly, there was only one real way for the East Germany to not be a failed state, to be fair, because most people would have left, because they went for what they perceived was the riches of West Germany, and it was a wealthy country. There is no doubt about that. I lived there. It was a very, very wealthy land, and it looked great, and a hell of a lot was going for it. So if you looked across from East Germany, where it would perceive that they were backward in terms of the fiscal things which they had. I'm talking about cars, I'm talking about houses, I'm talking about holiday, I'm talking about all of these things. Not necessarily the, if you will, psychological, cultural aspects. You know, it may well have been an easier country to live in many ways, the East, because the pressures may have been to some extent lesser. If you weren't doing well. Obviously, if you were doing well in West Germany, you couldn't beat it. But if you weren't doing well, maybe the state did look after you a little bit more. You had a job no matter what, because they made employment. If you're a woman, you could get to the highest levels because the system was meant to be that men and women were equal, etc., etc., etc. So there were aspects that, the East had going for it, but it's about as Clinton said, it's the economy, stupid. So that was the thing which meant that in the end, if they didn't come to an agreement, what was clearly going to happen was that East Germany would be deluded of population. So that's why in 1991 it was agreed with the Soviet Union, which was still a body, 1991 still a body, and that what would happen is that they would allow for East Germany to become part, and it would move out its battalions, corps of Soviet soldiers out of East Germany, and it could be reunified. That's what happened. But, and this is the point that I'm making with that, in doing that, there was an agreement made, and that agreement was articulated by the American, they call him Secretary of State, Baker. It was agreed that NATO would not expand 1 metre, that's the articulation that was said, 1 metre outside of East Germany. So in other words, that's the only place that would move with NATO in it. Now, yes, the other countries around it, Poland, Bulgaria, are all still part of the Warsaw Pact and all still part of, if you will, the Soviet area of control. And you can argue that when the Soviet Union itself fell and all these countries then basically fell from the communist yoke or from the communist fellowship, whichever way you want to look at it. Right, whichever way you want to look at it. When these countries fell from that they then had an understanding about where they should perceive themselves. So, what happened is, as the Soviet Union fell and it split up into its 15 Soviet republics, and people don't understand that, so the Ukraine was a republic within the Soviet Union. That's it. So and this is very important for Crimea, because Crimea originally was not part of the Ukrainian Soviet, but in the 1960s it was made part of the Ukrainian Soviet to give it an area that it could function within that Soviet area, because each had their own prime minister of the republic, just like basically like 15 republics. The Soviet Union had 15 republics, and the United States had 50 states. That's basically, the amalgam between the two, like our counties in Great Britain or states in Australia. So that's basically what it was like. But when the Soviet Union fell, it is as if all of those states, all of those counties, or all of those Länder, if you were in Germany, that they all then became their own countries. So Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Belarus, and of course Ukraine. They all became their own countries. So when you hear people turn around and say, oh, the Ukraine should never have given up its nuclear weapons, well, the argument is that the nuclear weapons were based in the centre, i.e. in Russia. Now, why? The reason why was dead simple. Because in the beginning, what the West didn't want to happen, and for the rest, read the United States, because it's always the United States, the other Western countries just follow. So for the West, read the United States. What the United States didn't want was for Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Georgia, for them all to have nuclear weapons. They didn't want that, because that would then undermine totally the idea of non-proliferation of nuclear weaponry. So the aim was, right, which is the biggest country within that? Which is the country where the control mainly is? Where did the government sit in the Soviet Union that controlled all these processes? Yeah, Russia will take that on board. So Russia gets the nuclear weapons when the agreement was made. And indeed, unless you were going to fight against Russia in order to make that way, that was always going to happen. So, but the West said there are guarantees that we'll give you that this, that if you put those weapons into one place, Russia, then that will be. And indeed, what Russia did with some places, we'll give you a nuclear umbrella. We'll assist you with our nuclear. Now, for most countries, of course, they didn't want that. Exceptions, Belarus, etc. So this is basically what happened with the nuclear weapons. So this is a redundant argument that the Ukraine shouldn't have given up its nuclear weapons. The Ukraine was never like South Africa. South Africa had its own nuclear weapons, and South Africa gave up its own nuclear weapons. The white South Africa I'm talking about, okay? The white South Africa that became South Africa of Nelson Mandela. Why? Because the last thing that the West wanted at the time was an African nation with nuclear weapons. Okay, so it was nigh on totally and utterly stated, you must give up your nuclear weapons before we can have talks that will give in one person, one rule. So majority rule, one person, one vote. Majority rule. Right? So that's a big difference. Then people are now trying to spin Ukraine as though it give up. No. That's not what happened. What happened is people didn't want the the various Soviets to have those nuclear weapons because it was too much to control and contend with. And the SALT agreements that were strategic arms limitation talks, agreements that were being made, were made from the centre. The centre was obviously sitting in Moscow, and Moscow happened to be in Russia. So that's the way it happened. So I mention all of this because as the Soviet Union disintegrated, as the Warsaw Pact, which is the Soviet Union's allies that used to be communist, all become capitalist and all move away from the Soviet Union, and all then, one by one, soon start to become part of the West's area of influence, right? It was seen by the leaders of Russia that this is now problematic. So at one stage, particularly when President Yeltsin had left and the US control over Russia was lessening, because what you've got to realise is during the initial stages of the Soviet Union breaking up and Russia becoming the all-encompassing body, they had a thing called the CIS at one stage, the Community of International States that all come together, which used to be the Soviet Union. Then that fell away, albeit that it's not come off the books. But they had that at one stage, so they were all speaking together. However, it never really functioned because they were independent. But when this all fell away, and you've got what you've got now, the Russian Federation, because there's still federated states that are part of Russia. When that happened, the US was in a very good position and could control in many ways how the economy of Russia was functioning. It could buy up a lot of Russia, could do a lot of deals with Russia in terms of oil, etc., etc. Right? So it was happy with what was going on because Russia was weak and powerful and not at all powerful, and it could dictate to Russia how things were functioning. The problem is that President Putin came in, and the last thing he wanted to do was to keep the country weak and muted. He didn't want that. It being muted. What he wanted was a powerful Russia, not a powerful Soviet Union. He had no intention in bringing about the Soviet Union because he was smart enough to understand that you'd have to keep fighting wars to keep these under power. So therefore what he did is he strengthened Russia. Now that was something that the US did not like. And to be fair, the United Kingdom did not like. And various countries. However, at one stage, definitely under Merkel, I thought that Germany was happy with that process because Germany could see that it could act as a go-between or at least a uniter and take advantage from the powerhouse of Russia in terms of its potential to pump oil and gas, etc. And that could be to the advantage of Germany because it could then get cheap oil and gas, which would run Germany's industry. And with its technical superiority, it then could sell its goods all over the world because its manufacturing process, in terms of the energy requirements for that manufacturing process, were then cheap. So, hence the Nord Stream 1 and then later the Nord Stream 2. The United States hated this because, and this is the problem, if this kept going, what it means is a closeness of Germany to Russia, which it was trying to isolate for its own ideas and its own good and its own control of Western Europe and actually Eastern Europe as well. Because there was only one nation that was powerful after the fall of the Soviet Union, and that was the United States. So the United States had complete hegemony. And I think that they call them neoconservatives in the United States, that was what they wanted to continue to have. It's a little bit like the Dulles Doctrine, to continue the fact that 60% of the world's energy is used by the United States, and they wanted to retain that process. Well, what better when there's only one nation with power, and that's us, the US. So that's how they were happy to do that. But of course, the problem was that Putin wasn't playing. He didn't want that. He wanted a Russia with respect amongst the other nations. So how do we do that? How do we solve this problem would be the question. And I think for some of the neocons, the point was, okay, he's allowed us to bring the Baltic states into NATO. Turkey's already in NATO, so it's covering him on that flank. Yeah, he's covered on that flank. So China is China, and China, is not necessarily the greatest friend of Russia, but it doesn't need to be an enemy. But that's covered as well. So therefore, all we need to do is cover the angle that says, this is what we need to do with Ukraine. Now, what the Russians had continually tried to do is make sure that a Ukraine people, the Ukrainian, it's not ever the people, is it? The Ukrainian ruling elite was friendly to Russia. So there was in power a Ukrainian-friendly government, a Ukrainian-friendly Russian government, if you will. So the United States went out and about with the Central Intelligence Agency to change that. And so there was this coup against Yushchenko and ousted him, the Maidan coup, and in came people who would be loyal, more orientated, who hated Russia, orientated towards the West. Unfortunately for them, many of them were the daughters and sons of neo-Nazis. And there was a very strong Banderist neo-Nazi perspective on it. Now, we're not going to go back into that because I've gone through that on other shows. All I'm trying to say is that this is what happened. And then by the time you get to 2022 and NATO has then made an agreement that Ukraine will come into NATO, even though previously many years before Putin has said, can we join NATO? Because you don't really need it anymore because there is no Soviet enemy and we're not communists anymore, we're arch-capitalists like you, and so we've got something in common. And they answered back from that, and this was under the government of Clinton, was no. So the reality is that Russia quite rightly saw itself as the only enemy of NATO, right? And then there was a problem. So how do they deal with that? Well, the dealing with that was Ukraine will never become another NATO country. Now, the US knew this because Bill Byrne, the guy who now runs the CIA at the time, was the ambassador in Russia, and he had told the United States that niet means niet. No means no. If you push this with Ukraine, there will be war. And this is what has happened. So what's the first thing the United States did? This is why I'm bringing it all together now, folks. The first thing the United States did was, right, we will sanction Russia in every way we can. We will sanction it. And when they did it, and if you listen to my program going back, Putin, is he mad, bad, or, I can't remember what the other point was I made, mad, bad, or strategic. Yeah. If you look at that, the first thing that I said was, the US has made a big mistake, because the big mistake was that the US said, okay, Russia, you can no longer use the SWIFT system. Now, the SWIFT system, for those of you who don't know, is an international way of moving money around. It's how money gets moved about. The dollar is basically the international store of value for many people. It's how things are bought. It's how oil is exchanged. It's how nations exchange goods with each other. So the dollar is an extremely powerful fiat currency. It's a currency that everybody needed to have. And this is why I said earlier on, when Chinese had lots of dollars. But the moment that these people realized two things. One is that they said to Russia, you now can no longer use the SWIFT system, so therefore cut them effectively off from using the way of moving their monies internationally, the dollars they've got internationally. And secondly, even worse, and I mentioned this as well, freezing the dollars that sat in American banks, because states buy dollars to have it centrally so they can buy the goods that they require, buy and sell oil, etc., 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 right? Every other country said to themselves, hold on, if we ever become an enemy of the United States, they will freeze our dollars. They will cut us out of the SWIFT system. And we will then be absolutely at the will of whatever the United States wants to do. We will no longer be able to function as a state, effectively. We will be a vassal of the United States fully, even if we are partially one now. So enemies, definitely, and even some friends thought to themselves, whoa, this is problematic. And this is why the BRICS has now become important. Now, the BRICS have been running for some time. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa were the nations that made up the BRICS. They'd been running for some time. But the moment that this happened, other countries said, hang on, we might want to join you, BRICS. because you guys are looking and seeing that the US is controlling everything, and the West, read the US, the West, is controlling everything. And if we ever become an enemy, and we might do, particularly people like Iran or countries which were on the precipice of being potential enemies for whatever reason, just speaking out of turn against the US, let's join up. And then the hammer came. The big hammer came. Then you had a country like Saudi Arabia, where it pumps out a lot of oil. Now, by the way, people don't understand this, but Russia pumps more oil than Saudi Arabia does. But the reality is, a small country like Saudi Arabia pumps a lot of oil, where America maintained that oil and needed it. Needs it less now because it pumps its own shale gas, etc., etc. But the reality is it's still powerful. All of a sudden, they saw that it might be a problem. Remember the Khashoggi incident, where clearly the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia had his officers go out and cause the death of the journalist Khashoggi. And then people were talking about, let's put heavy sanctions, heavy manners on Saudi Arabia, etc., etc. Let's make sure the Saudis can't do anything like this again. Let's make sure that Saudi Arabia is shown who is the boss, etc., etc., etc. So the Saudis clearly at this time thought, hang on, we might be on the horizon. So they asked, can we join BRICS? And once that started, many, many other nations, Ethiopia, etc., started saying, can we join BRICS? Right? Because they all realise that they are nothing but vassals if the US chooses that to be the case. So the war against Russia now became imperative. Russia invades the Ukraine, and frankly, within a month or so, it's at the gates of Kiev. There is a meeting in Turkey, and the agreement is made by the Ukrainians that the war can come to an end and basically they can keep some of the areas. Now, this is where you need to jump backwards and forwards always. Anybody who watched the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq realised that you can win the war. The United States won the war in Iraq very, very easily, both Iraq 1 and Iraq 2, right? And I was there for Iraq 2 all through the time, and then all through the time thereafter. But the counterinsurgency, they lost, right? Because afterwards, when you create people that hate you, you've then got to control the people that hate you. Now, you see, sometimes people misread the circumstance of the Second World War. The Second World War ended with obviously the defeat of the two primary elements within it. Don't get me wrong, there was the Axis, so you had Italy, example, and obviously who were fighting on the side of the Germans, and Hungary, example. But the two primary bodies were Germany, including Austria, and Japan. Okay? Both of those sit clearly and widely within the sphere of influence of the United States. But the part that people see is that what they don't see and what they don't understand is that in order for both those nations, and Austria off on the side, to do that, they kept millions of men in those countries. Millions, to make sure that they could control and suppress any potential uprising that might come from the defeated Germans or Japanese. Okay, they ran their government. They set up the systems. They made sure that they did what the occupying forces told them to do. And indeed, up until the very fall of the Berlin Wall, Berlin officially was still in the hands of the four powers. Okay, so that's why they needed to go to the Russians at the end, Soviets at the end, because those four powers, the Soviet Union, and on the Western side, obviously the United States, Great Britain, and France were the ones who controlled the, first and foremost, Berlin, and before that, the whole of West Germany. And that the Soviets controlled East Germany and obviously Berlin. So that's the way that ran. So you can see that kind of 45 years afterwards, there was still occupation forces there. that were keeping these people controlled. Now, what happened is after the Iraq winning, nigh on the day after, I think they had something like 550,000 US troops involved in that. We were the second biggest, Great Britain, with about 30,000 troops, something we should understand. Yeah. And as soon as they could, they got rid of the vast majority of those US troops out of the country and replaced them with, frankly, in many places, they replaced them with private armies of individuals who were hired by American companies to act as security within that area. Yes, there were US troops there, but they wanted as many as they could to have these private guys in to do a lot of jobs, because when you lose soldiers, you've got to explain to your public. When you lose privateers who are acting like soldiers or police or whatever they're acting like, yeah, it's just this geezer went to make a few pounds and he got killed. Bad luck. If he'd have not got killed and he'd been making 80, 90, 100, 300,000 pound a year, he'd have come quids in. So you see, this is what happened. So they tried to make money the object of controlling the state, obviously using where they could the coffers of Iraq to do it. But you actually really needed to keep enough troops there to control what was going to happen. And the same goes for Afghanistan. Indeed, so much so that in Afghanistan, they started to use NATO troops, so troops from all around Europe, in order to lessen the American objective and to put those NATO people in there, which, by the way, obviously the leader of NATO is always an American, so it's the same business. And most of the lift capacity, aircraft capacity, etc., is American. That's within NATO. So this is what they did. So NATO had an out of area operations working in Afghanistan, but in both cases they were defeated, because in the end the will was not there to keep the troops there for this period of time. They surged troops, as you remember, under Obama, but the will to keep 40, 50, 60, 100,000 people there, troops there, was not there. It's costing. They didn't want to do it. So hence there was a loss of both of those conflicts. In reality, who were chased out. Now, the reason I mention that is because it would have been clear to President Putin that to take the whole of the Ukraine would mean he'd have to leave in Western Ukraine hundreds of thousands of Russian troops to control the Western Ukraine. He'd have to leave them there after any conflict, which he called a special military project, he called it. Why does he call it that? Because he didn't want it to be a war. When we went into Afghanistan, it was shock and awe. Everybody who saw the Iraq conflict, Afghanistan too, but the Iraq conflict, absolutely remember General Schwarzkopf saying, "This is shock and awe." Aircraft went in, blew everything up, blew up all of the areas that had electricity, etc., water plants, everything to destroy and degrade the capacity of the Iraqi to fight. Okay? Putin never did that. He never did that. Because his whole idea was not to take the whole of Ukraine. And those people who talk about him going further are lunatics. They don't understand warfare. There's no intention of him going any further. Now, of course, can things change? Can the circumstances of war change things? To my mind, I believe when he went in, what he wanted to do was basically regime change, like the United States had done at least 75 times, and basically get in there people who would then say, as it was with the peace agreement that was nigh on signed by President Zelensky, until our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, went in and told him not to sign. And by the way, you should also note that when that agreement was signed nigh on, it was all there, it was all made, it was ready to go. As a show of goodwill, Putin withdrew his military from Kiev. So at the start of the war, less than 100,000 Russian troops went in. The Ukrainian army was about 330,000, and then when they mobilised, about 500,000, well trained, because, as Angela Merkel later said, she'd been helped training them obviously with the United Kingdom, United States, France, had been helped training them for 12 years previously. So you see, the West had played a double deal on Putin. And I think President Putin then saw that subsequently and is now so bloody minded he will not go to believe anything the West is saying. So the reality now is, from where I think he had limited war aims, and nobody can really know other than the people who run the Kremlin. And we always talk about one person. It's never one person, it's a system. So the people who run the Kremlin. But I would suggest to you that what they wanted to do was basically to take over the Russian-speaking areas. Indeed, I even suggested right in the beginning, and I've said this on my other poem about that was not their intention to take over even the Russian-speaking areas of Luhansk and places like that. That was not their intention. Their intention was just to secure the fact that these people would not keep on being killed. 14,000 of them had been killed by the Ukrainian forces since 2014, 2015, 2016. So the reality was that I believe they basically wanted to stop that, prevent a government that was totally anti-Russian, and to stabilise the situation. That was it. Those were the war aims. Unfortunately, the first thing that happened is when that wasn't done, he took Crimea. Well, of course, Crimea, and funnily enough, it's just been said today by President Duda from Poland that of course, these are his words, of course, there is a long history of Russians running Crimea. That's what he said. So everybody knows it, they know it. They know this, the politicians. They're just telling the public nonsense. Everybody knows that these are Russian people. That's what he said. And that Russians have run this. Right? So this is the problem you have when you just listen to one view of things and don't understand how the politic is in the world. So that is basically what had happened. And that's where we get to where we are now. Now, why is this alarming? I think I'm going to come back to you looking at my timings and explain why I think this is alarming, and also to connect to you with the situation vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine straight after this. So I'll see you again next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
For a quarter of a century, I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.